What Americans don't understand about Europe. Ever wondered what people across the Atlantic really think of each other? Americans and Europeans often hold big misconceptions about how the other side lives. In this video, we're busting those myths and exploring the real cultural, economic, and political differences between America and Europe. We'll highlight both strengths and weaknesses on each side of the pond and see how media and stereotypes color our views. Get ready for some surprises, a few laughs, and a fresh perspective on the US versus them narrative. Cultural misconceptions and differences. Language and travel. A common American assumption is that everyone in Europe speaks multiple languages fluently. While many Europeans do learn a second language in school, not all are polyglots. Fun fact. In Sweden, about 60% of people use a second language daily, but in France only about 20% do. And Americans aren't as linguistically inept as the stereotype suggests. Roughly 23% of Americans speak another language at home or work, not far below the European average. So not every European is a multilingual genius, and plenty of Americans quietly speak Spanish, Mandarin, or French. On the flip side, some Europeans assume Americans never travel abroad and know little about the world. It's true that only about 45% of Americans have a passport, up from just 3% in the 1980s, meaning many have never left the country. Meanwhile, Europeans benefit from dozens of countries a short train ride away. A weekend trip from Germany to France is as easy as an American going from one state to another. Europeans thus tend to be more familiar with neighboring nations, whereas Americans, living in a country that's a continent unto itself, may not venture abroad as often. Geography and size. Europeans often joke about Americans' geography skills. You've heard the stereotype that Americans can't find Europe on a map. That's exaggerated, but it's true that many Americans don't learn much world geography in school. At the same time, Americans can be surprised by Europe's compact size and close-knit countries. An American might not realize you can fit several European nations inside Texas, or that a 2-hour flight in Europe can land you in a half-dozen different cultures and languages. Likewise, Europeans might not grasp how vast the US is until they ask an American, "Can you drive from Chicago to Los Angeles for the weekend?" Answer, "Not unless you have 30 hours to spare." Because Europe is more densely packed, Europeans find it normal to hop across borders, while Americans can travel thousands of miles and still be in the United States. These differences feed misconceptions. Some Europeans think Americans are ignorant of the world since fewer travel overseas, and some Americans lump Europe together as if it were one country. In reality, both sides have some blind spots born from geography. Yes, some Americans struggle with world maps, but as that driving example shows, some Europeans are shocked by US geography too. Consider the stereotype of the loud American versus the stoic European. Americans have a reputation for being outgoing, talkative, and even loud, whether it's cheering at a sports bar or striking up conversations with strangers. Europeans, depending on where you are, might be more reserved in public and stick to their own circle. Another noticeable difference is patriotism. Many Europeans are struck by how often Americans display their flag or express national pride. Indeed, Americans are generally more openly patriotic. One survey found about half of Americans believe their culture is superior to others. Europeans love their countries too, but open flag waving or claims of being the best are less common, outside of sports. To Europeans, American patriotism can seem excessive, while Americans might see Europeans as less proud. The truth is, both care about their identities, they just show it differently. Understanding these different social habits helps avoid misinterpretations. An Italian might find an American's bubbly friendliness insincere, while an American might mistake an Italian's more subdued demeanor as disinterest, when it's just a cultural style. Perhaps the most infamous stereotype is the fat, fast food-loving American versus the health-conscious European. There is some truth here. The US adult obesity rate is around 36%, significantly higher than in most European countries. American portions are larger and fast food and sugary drinks are widespread. Meanwhile, many Europeans walk more in daily life and have diets rich in fresh, minimally processed foods. However, it's not black and white. Europe has McDonald's and junk food too, and obesity is rising there, though still below US levels. And not all Americans eat burgers every day. There are plenty of regional cuisines and health-conscious trends in the US. Yes, kale smoothies are a thing. So while an American visiting Europe might notice people lingering over smaller portions, and a European visiting America might be stunned by the size of a Coke and fries, remember that each place has a range of lifestyles. Bottom line, America's food culture includes extremes of indulgence but also great diversity, and Europe's traditional diets are generally healthier. But Western fast food culture has made inroads. Each side can learn from the other's food habits, and both could probably eat a little better. Culturally, misconceptions abound when we generalize. Not every American is a loud, monolingual fast food lover, and not every European is a polyglot sophisticate sipping espresso. Both continents contain multitudes. Americans live to work, Europeans work to live. This saying captures a common belief that Europeans have it easy while Americans grind away. There's truth here. The average American works more hours and takes less vacation than the average European. The US has no federal law guaranteeing paid vacation, whereas the European Union mandates at least 20 paid vacation days by law. As a result, many Americans get only 10 to 15 days off a year, and some don't use them all, while Europeans commonly enjoy 4 to 6 weeks of holidays. One survey found a majority of Europeans, 59%, take over 21 vacation days a year, whereas 60% of Americans never take a 2-week vacation in a single stretch. No wonder the US is called no vacation nation. This feeds stereotypes. Americans might view Europeans as lazy or unambitious, while Europeans might see Americans as workaholics. The reality is shaped by both culture and policy. In Europe, long holidays and shorter work weeks are standard in many countries and often protected by law, so taking a month off in summer is normal. In the US, a hustle culture prevails in many industries. Success is often tied to long hours and constant effort. Many Americans feel pressure or guilt about taking time off, whereas Europeans are more likely to disconnect from work on weekends and vacations. The strength of the European model is a healthier work-life balance and less burnout. Surveys show about 51% of Europeans are happy with their work-life balance, while a weakness can be slightly lower productivity growth or career advancement. The American model's strength is a dynamic, go-getter work culture that can drive innovation and higher incomes, but the weakness is more stress and less downtime. Neither extreme is ideal, and indeed, younger generations in the US are starting to seek a more European-style balance, while some Europeans admire American entrepreneurial drive. Jobs and unemployment. Many Americans point out the low US unemployment rate, often around 3 to 4%, versus Europe's higher rate, about 6% in recent years. They argue Europe's labor laws and regulations hinder job growth. There is some truth. Countries like Spain and Greece have struggled with high unemployment, especially among youth. However, others like Germany have low jobless rates similar to America. Europe's stronger worker protections can make employers more cautious, while the US's flexible hire and fire culture results in more jobs, but less security. It's a classic trade-off. Europe prioritizes stability, America prioritizes flexibility. Healthcare and social safety nets. Perhaps the biggest philosophical divide is how each society handles healthcare and social support. Europeans often can't fathom the American system of private health insurance and find it shocking that someone could go bankrupt from medical bills. In turn, some Americans have misconceptions about European healthcare, thinking it's socialized medicine or that you wait forever for care. The facts: every country in Europe has universal health coverage for its citizens, and the US is the only wealthy nation without universal healthcare. This doesn't mean Americans are denied care, but tens of millions have no health insurance, and many others pay high out-of-pocket costs. Paradoxically, the US spends far more on healthcare per person than any European country, yet outcomes aren't better. For example, US life expectancy, about 78 years, is a few years lower than in Western Europe, around 82, and rates of chronic illness and infant mortality are higher in the US. How can this be? The American system is very high-tech and innovative, but it's also inequitable and inefficient. On the other hand, European systems, whether the NHS in Britain or France's insurance model, provide broad coverage with generally good outcomes, but they do have downsides like occasional longer waits for elective procedures or somewhat less glitzy hospitals. The stereotype some Americans have is that European healthcare means rationing and delays. In reality, if you need urgent surgery in Europe, you get it just as quickly as in the US. The difference is, you won't get a huge bill afterward. The strength of Europe's model is peace of mind. Healthcare is not tied to your job or wallet, while a weakness can be higher taxes and a bit more bureaucracy. The US model's strength is top-notch care available quickly for those who can afford it, and a drive for medical innovation. Many new drugs and technologies come out of the US, but the weakness is that many people fall through the cracks and overall public health is worse than it should be given the spending. Beyond healthcare, this difference in philosophy shows up in education and welfare. College tuition in much of Europe is low or free, supported by taxpayers, whereas American students often pay hefty tuition and may graduate with loans. Americans, in turn, point out that their universities dominate global rankings, thanks partly to those tuition dollars and private funding, but Europeans counter that college shouldn't require deep debt just to get an education. Similarly, Europeans usually have more robust social safety nets, things like longer paid maternity leave, unemployment benefits, and public pensions. Americans have some of these, like Social Security and Medicare for seniors, but generally the European versions are more generous. This leads to stereotypes like Americans thinking Europeans are coddled by the state, and Europeans thinking Americans leave vulnerable people to fend for themselves. Again, each system has pros and cons. Europe's approach means less poverty and stress about basic needs at the cost of higher taxes. The US approach means lower taxes and more disposable income for many, but those who are poor or unlucky can struggle more without as much government aid. Taxes and quality of life. To support those services, Europeans generally pay higher taxes. Value-added tax on goods is around 20% in many EU countries, versus 0 to 10% sales tax in the US. And income taxes are often higher on middle and high-income earners in Europe. Americans often see that and think Europe is overtaxed. But what do Europeans get? Healthcare that's free at the point of use, affordable university, stronger infrastructure, and more. Many Europeans, in turn, might not realize that while Americans pay less tax, they pay more out of pocket for things like health and education. Many benefits, like employer-provided health insurance or retirement plans, don't show up as taxes but still come from someone's pocket. When it comes to quality of life, it's a mixed bag. By many measures, life expectancy, child well-being, freedom from poverty, Western Europe scores better than the US. European cities tend to be very safe, clean, and well-organized, with excellent public transport. On the other hand, the average American enjoys more living space and lower prices for consumer goods. Gasoline, cars, and big houses are much more affordable in the US than in Europe. So an American middle-class family might have a large home and 2 cars, which is pretty common in the US, whereas a middle-class German family might live in a smaller apartment and rely on trains, but have universal health coverage and virtually free college. Neither scenario is universally better. It depends on what one values. This is why you'll find some Europeans moving to the US for opportunity and a big backyard, while some Americans move to Europe for a slower pace and social benefits. In short, economically, the US and Europe take different paths to prosperity. Misconceptions arise when we assume one side's approach is all good or all bad. Both have enviable strengths and both have issues they're working on. A balanced perspective lets us appreciate, say, Europe's trains and healthcare, and America's tech innovation and flexibility without thinking either is a paradise or a failure. Political differences and misconceptions, government and politics. Americans sometimes talk about Europe as if it's a single country with one government. In reality, Europe is a continent of separate nations. Even within the European Union, consisting of 27 countries, each nation has its own government. The EU makes certain common laws and policies, but it's not a United States of Europe. There is no single European president or unified European army, as EU countries have their own militaries. This misconception can lead Americans to oversimplify European issues. Why can't Europe just do X? Well, there are 27 different electorates to consider. Conversely, Europeans might not realize how the American political system works. For example, Europeans often follow US presidential elections closely, but may be confused by terms like electoral college or why a candidate can win the presidency without winning the popular vote. Unlike most European countries, which use parliamentary systems with multiple parties, the US has a two-party presidential system. This means American politics is usually a contest between Republicans, who are conservatives, and Democrats, who are liberals, whereas European countries often have several parties like a conservative party, a socialist party, Greens, liberals, nationalists, and so on, that must form coalitions. An American might stereotype European politics as unstable or fragmented due to coalition governments, while a European might see US politics as overly binary and polarized. Each system has pros and cons. US two-party politics offers clear choices but can leave out nuanced views, while Europe's multi-party setups give more representation but can be messy to govern. Also, American states have significant powers, so laws can vary widely by state. For example, gun laws or school curricula differ between Texas and New York, which Europeans sometimes don't realize. Meanwhile, Americans might not grasp the complexity of the EU, for instance, how Brussels can make regulations, but each country still has its own laws and budget. Values and social issues. The US and Western Europe are both modern, pluralistic societies, but there are differences in social attitudes. One big one is religion. Americans are generally more religious than Europeans. Far more Americans attend church regularly or say religion is very important to their lives. This influences politics. Issues like abortion, school prayer, and LGBTQ+ rights have been highly politicized in the US, whereas in much of Europe, they've been less divisive. A European might be surprised at how openly US politicians invoke God, while an American might be surprised at how secular many European societies are. Another difference is attitudes toward government's role. European political culture, broadly speaking, is comfortable with a bigger government role in the economy, national healthcare, state media like the BBC, etc., while American political culture emphasizes small government and free enterprise. This is why policies that Americans argue over, like universal healthcare or stricter gun control, often already exist in Europe with broad support. Yet, Europeans can misconstrue this as all Americans being against such ideas. In reality, American public opinion is split, and the political system is designed to change slowly. Guns and crime. Perhaps no issue bewilders Europeans more about America than gun laws. Europeans often assume everyone in America has a gun, and see news of US mass shootings with horror. It's true that civilian gun ownership is dramatically higher in the US than anywhere in Europe. The US has about 120 firearms per 100 people, more guns than people. In contrast, even gun-friendly European countries like Germany or France have only about 19 guns per 100 people, and the UK has around 5 per 100. For Europeans who often need a difficult licensing process to own even one firearm, the ease of access in many US states is mind-boggling. This leads to the misconception that the US is extremely violent, or that shootings happen everywhere. While the US does have a higher rate of gun homicide and multiple mass shootings per year, a serious issue, it's still a vast country where the majority of people will never be a victim of gun crime. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, see gun ownership as a fundamental right tied to personal freedom and self-defense. This is hard for Europeans to fully understand, coming from societies where only police and hunters generally have guns. The American reverence for a right to bear arms is a unique cultural political trait. It does come with consequences. The US gun homicide rate is significantly higher than Europe's, and school shootings, while still rare, happen more often in the US than elsewhere. European media often highlight these American tragedies intensively, leading to exaggerated perceptions. Conversely, some Americans might think Europeans are defenseless or overly trusting of government for protection. Both views miss context. In Europe, people generally feel safe without owning guns, whereas in the US, many law-abiding citizens feel safer having one. The role of media and stereotypes. Why do so many misconceptions persist? Media and pop culture play a big role. American media tends to be very US-focused. One study found that while 93% of Americans follow national news, only 17% follow international news closely. This means many Americans get a limited view of Europe, often relying on Hollywood movies or the occasional newsflash. Hollywood's portrayal of Europe can be either romantic, picturesque villages and royal palaces, or negative, conflict and crisis, rarely showing everyday life. Europeans, meanwhile, consume a lot of American media. Hollywood films and TV shows are popular in Europe, and international news often highlights the most dramatic US events. For example, European news extensively covers American mass shootings and political turmoil. A Spanish exchange student noted that her European friends believed school shootings happen constantly in the US, an impression amplified by media coverage. While such tragedies are sadly more common in America than in Europe, they are not daily occurrences. There's also an imbalance in attention. People around the world closely follow US news, but the reverse isn't true. So, Europeans often know more about day-to-day America than Americans know about Europe. This imbalance, combined with stereotypes in movies and online, skews perceptions. An American who hasn't traveled might think Europe is either a fairy tale land of castles or a uniform socialist bloc. A European who hasn't met Americans might think they're all rich, loud, or ignorant, depending on the movies or news. In reality, both continents are diverse and complex. The best antidote is diversifying our sources of information, reading foreign news, watching each other's films, and of course travel and personal interactions. Seeing things firsthand or talking to real people can quickly dissolve media-fueled misconceptions. Conclusion. Big picture. Americans and Europeans have more in common than not. They share core values, intertwined histories, and enjoy each other's cultures. But our journey through these misconceptions shows that differences in daily life, economics, and politics can lead to real misunderstandings. The good news is that with knowledge and an open mind, we can clear them up, turning confusion into appreciation. We've seen that Americans often value individualism, work, and freedom a bit more, while Europeans prioritize community, leisure, and security a bit more, a result of different histories and philosophies. Each side has strengths and weaknesses. Europe generally excels in quality of life metrics and social support, while America excels in innovation and economic dynamism. Europe's challenges include bureaucratic hurdles and aging populations, while America's include social inequalities and polarization. Neither is perfect, and neither is a disaster. So, next time you hear someone generalize about Americans or Europeans, you can say, well, it's not that simple. By busting these myths, we move beyond an us versus them mentality and realize it's more about learning from each other. Americans can adopt some European lessons, like the value of vacation and universal healthcare, and Europeans can take some pages from Americans, like entrepreneurial spirit or optimism. In the end, the world is too connected for us to cling to outdated stereotypes. Let's celebrate the differences as interesting talking points rather than divisive gaps. Thanks for watching, and bon voyage on your next cross-cultural adventure. You might be surprised how much there is to learn when we leave our assumptions behind.